The silence of the northern forest was not empty. It was heavy, pressing down on the ancient pines like a physical weight. In the village of Oakhaven, silence was something to be feared. Silence meant the winter had frozen the birds in the trees. Silence meant the wolves were hunting. But the deepest silence of all belonged to one man. A man who walked like a mountain and carried a shadow that swallowed the light. They called him Magnus. To the children who whispered behind their hands, he was the ogre. To the elders who remembered the blood of the old wars, he was the broken blade. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, a monolith of muscle and scarred flesh. His face was a map of violence, etched with the white lines of old knife wounds and the jagged remnants of a nose broken too many times to count. But the most terrifying scar was the one he kept hidden beneath a thick woolen scarf wrapped perpetually around his neck, a ragged, ugly line where a jagged blade had stolen his voice 20 years ago. Magnus lived apart. His hut was a rough structure of dark timber and stone, perched dangerously high on the ridge, bordering the deep wilderness where civilized folk dared not tread. He came down only to trade. He would drop massive bundles of firewood or fresh game at the market square before the sun even crested the peaks, take the meager coin offered without counting it, and vanish back into the trees. He never haggled, he never waved, he never smiled. In the eyes of Oakhaven, Magnus was not a man. He was a useful monster, a tool to be used until it broke. But the gods of the north are cruel, and they do not let monsters sleep forever. The doom of Oakhaven arrived not with fire or steel, but with a cough. It started in the autumn, damp and insidious. The red fever. It swept through the valley like an invisible fire, burning through households with terrifying speed. It took the old, their lungs too weak to fight. It took the strong, their bodies burning up from the inside. In a small cottage near the river, the fever found the home of Togrin, the miller. Togrin was a good man, loud with laughter and flour, dusted hands. His wife Elena was the kind of woman who sang to her garden. They fought the fever for 3 days. On the 4th day, the silence came for them. They left behind 5 children, 5 souls cast adrift in a world that had suddenly turned cold. Eric, the eldest at 10 winters, stood by his parents' bed, his small hand gripping the cold fingers of his father. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The shock had frozen him. Beside him, Bjorn, 7 years old and sturdy as a little bull, wept openly. Astrid and Ingrid, the twin girls of 5, huddled together in the corner, eyes wide with a terror they couldn't name. And in the crib, wrapped in blankets that smelled of sickness, lay Freya, 6 months old, hungry and wailing for a mother who would never wake. The village council gathered 3 days later in the great hall. The mood was grim. The air smelled of wood smoke and fear. The harvest had been poor before the fever struck, and now, with so many hands lost to the sickness, the specter of starvation loomed over Oakhaven. The High Elder, a man named Hakon with eyes like flint and a heart withered by years of hard choices, sat at the head of the table. He looked at the 5 shivering children standing in the center of the hall. He didn't see tragedy, he saw mouths, 5 hungry mouths that would need bread, milk, and warmth through the coming winter. "We must be practical," Hakon announced, his voice echoing in the rafters. "The miller left no coin, only debts. The village stores are light. We cannot burden one family with 5 orphans." "What are you saying, elder?" a woman asked from the crowd, clutching her own child tight. "I am saying we divide them," Hakon said coldly. "The blacksmith has lost an apprentice. The boy Eric is strong enough to work the bellows. He goes to the forge." Eric stepped forward, clutching baby Freya to his chest. "No," he said, his voice trembling but defiant. "Papa made me promise. We stay together. The tanner needs help scraping hides. Bjorn is small, but he can work. He goes to the tannery. The boat leaves at dawn." "And the baby!" Eric screamed, tears finally spilling over. "What about Freya? She needs milk. She needs us." The hall went deadly silent. Hakon looked at the infant, his expression hardening. "We have no wet nurses with milk to spare." The fever took them too. A babe without milk in winter is a ghost waiting to pass. He leaned back. "She will be left to the mercy of the gods. Place her in the forest. If it is her fate to survive, the spirits will tend to her." A gasp of horror rippled through the crowd. Exposure. It was an ancient, brutal custom, reserved only for the darkest times, but no one spoke up. Fear of their own hunger silenced them. "Take them," Hakon ordered the guards. 2 large men stepped forward. One grabbed Eric by the shoulder. The boy fought like a wildcat, kicking and biting, but he was starving and small. The guard wrenched him back. Another guard reached for the screaming baby Freya. "No, please!" Eric shrieked. "She's just a baby. Don't take her." The guard's hand closed around the bundle. The twins began to scream. Boom! The heavy oak doors of the great hall slammed open with a force that shook dust from the ceiling beams. A blast of wind and snow swirled into the room, extinguishing the torches near the entrance. In the doorway stood a silhouette that blocked out the pale winter sun. Magnus. He stepped into the light, his boots thudding against the floorboards like the slow beat of a war drum. He was covered in snow, his breath misting in the cold air. He wore a cloak made of black bear fur, and his massive woodsman's axe hung loosely at his side. The guards froze. Håkon stumbled back in his chair. Magnus never came to the council. Magnus never entered the village proper. He was a ghost of the forest. Magnus walked to the center of the room. The crowd parted like water before a shark. He didn't look at the elder. He didn't look at the guards. His eyes, blue and cold as a glacier, were locked on the children. He saw the terror in Eric's eyes. He saw the twins clinging to each other. He saw the guard holding the baby like a sack of grain. Magnus moved. One moment he was standing still. The next, he was towering over the guard holding Freya. He didn't draw his axe. He simply reached out a hand scarred and calloused, the size of a shovel blade, and took the baby. The guard surrendered her without a fight, trembling as the giant loomed over him. Magnus cradled the tiny, wailing bundle in the crook of one massive arm. She looked impossibly small against his chest. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable beneath his beard and scarf. Then he looked at the other guards holding the boys. He made a sharp, cutting motion with his free hand. "Release them." The guards looked at Håkon for orders, but the elder was pale. You have no business here, Silent One," Håkon stammered. "These children are the village's concern." Magnus slowly turned his head to face the elder. The intensity of his stare was physical. He shifted the baby, reached into his belt pouch, and pulled out a heavy leather bag. He tossed it onto the elder's table. It landed with a heavy, dull clunk of silver. Håkon opened the bag. His eyes widened. It was filled with silver coins, years of earnings that Magnus had hoarded, having no one to spend them on. Magnus pointed at the coin. He pointed at the 5 children. Then he pointed at the door. "I buy their debt. I take them. You." The village blacksmith scoffed, stepping forward. "You want them. You're a beast, Magnus. You live in a cave. You can't even speak to them. How will you raise 5 children? You'll crush them by accident or eat them before the snow melts." Laughter, nervous and cruel, bubbled up from the crowd. Magnus didn't blink. He stepped closer to the blacksmith, towering over him by a full foot. He placed one hand on the blacksmith's anvil that stood near the door, a solid block of iron. He squeezed. His knuckles turned white. The muscles in his arm coiled like pythons. He didn't speak, but the threat was clear. "I am not a man, you mock." He turned back to the children. Eric was staring at him, eyes wide. Magnus crouched down, a mountain lowering itself. He held out a hand to Eric. He didn't smile. His face didn't know how, but his eyes softened, just a fraction. Eric looked at the guards who wanted to enslave him. He looked at the elder who wanted to kill his baby sister. Then he looked at the monster who had saved her. Eric grabbed his sibling's hands. "Come on," he whispered. He walked to Magnus and stood by his leg. Magnus stood up. He nodded once to the room, a final, contemptuous farewell. He turned and walked out into the storm, 5 small shadows trailing in the wake of his massive cloak. The journey up the mountain was brutal. The snow was knee-deep for the children. Magnus walked slowly, breaking the path for them, shielding them from the wind with his body. When little Bjorn stumbled and fell, too exhausted to cry, Magnus scooped him up and placed him on his shoulder. When the twins began to shiver violently, he stopped, took off his massive bear fur cloak and wrapped it around both of them, walking the rest of the way in just his tunic, impervious to the biting cold. They reached his hut as night fell. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress against the wild. The walls were thick logs, the roof layered with sod and snow. Inside, it smelled of pine resin curing leather and sawdust. It was one large room, filled with tools, traps, and furs. Magnus ushered them in and barred the heavy door. He stoked the fire until it roared. The children huddled together on a pile of wolfskins, watching him with fearful eyes. Now that the adrenaline of the rescue had faded, the reality set in. They were alone in the wilderness with the ogre. That first night was a nightmare. Baby Freya, hungry and confused, screamed for hours. Her wails bounced off the timber walls. Magnus paced the floor, looking frantic. He held her this way and that, rocking her stiffly, but he couldn't make the sounds a mother makes. He couldn't shush her. Eric watched him from the corner. He looked at the boy, then at the empty larder. He grabbed a wooden bucket and stormed out into the blizzard. He was gone for an hour. The children huddled together, terrified he had abandoned them. But the door opened again. Magnus returned, covered in snow, bleeding from a scratch on his cheek, but triumphant. The bucket was full of steaming, warm milk. He had climbed the icy cliffs in the dark to a wild goat herd he tracked. He had wrestled a nanny goat in the snow to milk her. He dipped a clean rag into the milk and brought it to Freya's lips. She latched onto it, sucking greedily. Magnus let out a breath that sounded like a cracking branch. He slumped against the wall, feeding the babe drop by drop, watching the other children eat the dried meat and hardtack he offered. As they ate, Magnus watched them. He saw how broken they were. He realized, with a heavy heart, that saving them from the elder was the easy part. Keeping them alive and happy would be the war. Weeks turned into a month. Life in the cabin fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Magnus realized he couldn't speak to them, so he had to become a master of action. He couldn't tell them, "I love you," so he showed them. He saw that the twins, Astrid and Ingrid, were terrified of the dark. So Magnus spent 3 nights without sleep, carving. He took a block of birchwood and shaped it with his knife. When the girls woke up, they found a nightlight carved from a hollowed-out turnip with a candle inside, casting shapes of dancing rabbits on the walls. He saw that Bjorn was angry, punching the walls in frustration over his lost parents. Magnus took the boy outside. He didn't scold him. He handed him a small axe and pointed to a dead tree. He showed Bjorn how to channel that anger into the wood, how to swing with purpose. They chopped wood together until their arms burned, and Bjorn finally collapsed into Magnus's side, sobbing. Magnus just held him, a silent anchor in the boy's storm. And for Eric, who tried so hard to be the father figure, Magnus gave respect. He taught Eric to check the traps. He taught him to read the wind. He treated the 10-year-old not as a child, but as his second in command. Communication became a dance. Magnus invented a sign language for them. A tap on the chest meant hungry. No. 2 fingers tapping the nose meant wolf. Stay inside. Rubbing his palms together meant story time. But he could act. In the evenings, by the firelight, he would perform. He would use shadow puppets on the wall to tell legends of dragons and heroes. He would use his massive body to mime the great bear hunts. The cabin, once a place of silent solitude, began to fill with the sound of children's laughter. One evening, little Freya, now fat and happy on goat's milk, crawled onto Magnus's lap while he was whittling. She reached up with her tiny hand and touched the scarf around his neck. Magnus froze. No one touched the scarf. Beneath it was his shame, his weakness, but he didn't pull away. He realized he wasn't just keeping them alive. They were bringing him back to life. But peace is a fragile thing in a harsh world. Winter began to fade, and the snows melted to reveal the brown earth. Down in the village, the food stores were empty. The silver Magnus had given Håkon was gone. Spent on imported wine and bad trades, Håkon sat in his hall, bitter and desperate. He looked up at the smoke rising from Magnus's mountain. He remembered the children. He remembered the rumors of Eastern traders docking at the fjord, men who paid gold for young, healthy slaves. "The ogre has grown fat on our charity," Håkon muttered to his new captain of the guard, a cruel man named Rolf. "He holds 5 children who belong to the village. The boys are old enough for the mines. The girls would fetch a high price in the markets of the south. He will not give them up," Rolf said, sharpening his sword. "He is one man," Håkon sneered, "a mute cripple. We are 20. We go tomorrow," while he checks his traps. The next morning was bright and crisp. Magnus kissed Freya on the forehead, signaled Eric to bolt the door, and headed into the deep woods to hunt. He was tracking an elk, moving miles away from the hut. He was deep in the valley when the wind changed. It carried a scent that made his blood run cold. Smoke, not wood smoke. The acrid, oily smell of burning thatch. Magnus stopped. He dropped the elk trail. He turned toward the mountain. He felt a vibration in the earth, the sound of many horses. He began to run. A man of Magnus's size should not be able to move fast, but fear is a powerful fuel. He tore through the underbrush, snapping branches like twigs. He bounded over boulders, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Eric, Bjorn, Astrid, Ingrid, Freya. He crested the ridge and looked down at his home. The door was smashed in, the furniture was dragged out into the snow, and there, being marched down the trail in chains, were his children. Rolf and his men were dragging them. Eric was bleeding from the head, stumbling. The twins were screaming. Håkon rode on a horse at the front, holding baby Freya like a trophy. A sound tore out of Magnus's throat, not a word, but a guttural roar of pure primal rage that shook the birds from the trees. The soldiers stopped and looked back. They saw a demon descending the mountain. Magnus didn't have his axe. He had left it to move faster. He didn't care. He hit the rear guard like an avalanche. He tackled the first soldier, lifting him bodily and throwing him into a tree with bone-shattering force. The man crumpled. Håkon shrieked. 3 swordsmen rushed Magnus. He didn't slow down. He ducked under a swinging blade, grabbed the attacker's arm, and twisted. The soldier screamed as his shoulder dislocated. Magnus used him as a human shield to block a spear thrust, then shoved him into the others. He was a whirlwind of violence. He took a sword slash to the forearm, then a spear point to the thigh. Blood sprayed onto the snow, but Magnus didn't feel it. He punched a man in the helmet so hard the metal dented inward, knocking him cold. He kicked another in the chest, sending him flying 10 feet back. "Daddy," Ingrid screamed. The word pierced the red fog of Magnus's rage. "Oh, Daddy, he fought harder." He reached Rolf, the captain. Rolf was fast, slashing Magnus across the chest. Magnus grunted, caught the blade with his bare hand, cutting his palm to the bone, and ripped the sword from Rolf's grip. With a massive backhand, he sent Rolf spinning into the snow, unconscious. Now only Håkon remained. The elder sat on his horse, clutching Freya, his face pale as milk. He held the dagger to the baby's throat. "Stay back," Håkon squealed, his voice cracking. "I'll kill her. I swear it." Magnus froze. He stood 10 paces away, heaving, covered in his own blood and the blood of his enemies. He looked at the trembling old man. He looked at the terrified baby. Magnus slowly raised his hands. He fell to his knees in the snow. "I surrender," Håkon laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "See, the beast knows his place. Bind him. We will sell him to the pits along with the whelps." The surviving guards scrambled up, ropes in hand. They approached Magnus cautiously, but Håkon had made a mistake. In his arrogance, he lowered the dagger from Freya's neck for just a second to point at Magnus. That second was all Eric needed. The boy, whose hands were bound but whose legs were free, launched himself at Håkon's horse. He bit the horse's flank as hard as he could. The horse reared up, whinnying in pain. Håkon lost his grip. He tumbled backward, dropping the dagger and the baby. Freya flew through the air. Time seemed to slow down. Magnus exploded from his knees. He ignored the guards. He dove forward, sliding across the ice and mud. He extended his arms. He caught her. Millimeters from the frozen ground, his massive hands cradled her soft body. He curled around her, taking the impact of the fall on his own scarred back. He rolled, shielding her, and stood up with a roar. Håkon lay in the mud, groaning, his leg broken by the fall. He looked up to see Magnus towering over him. The giant's shadow fell across him like a tombstone. Then he turned to Håkon. He reached down and grabbed the elder by the collar. Then he turned to Håkon. He reached down and grabbed the Traken. He lifted him effortlessly into the air, feet dangling. Magnus pulled Håkon's face close to his own. The elder stared into eyes that held the fury of 1,000 storms. "Please," Håkon whimpered. "Mercy." Magnus tightened his grip. He could snap the old man's neck like a twig. Every instinct screamed at him to end this threat forever. But then he felt a small hand on his leg. Bjorn and Astrid and Ingrid. They were hugging his blood-soaked legs. "Papa," Eric whispered. "Don't. You aren't a monster. Don't let them make you one." Magnus looked at the shivering, pathetic man in his grasp. He looked at his children, who were looking at him not with fear, but with hope. Slowly, agonizingly, the rage drained away. Magnus didn't need to kill this man to defeat him. He spat in Hakon's face. Then he tossed him into a snowbank like garbage. He turned to the surviving guards, who were backing away in terror. He pointed a bloody finger at the village, then drew a line in the snow. Cross this line again, and there will be no mercy. The guards grabbed their broken leader and fled. They ran stumbling down the mountain, leaving their weapons and their dignity behind. Magnus stood there, swaying slightly from blood loss. He looked at his children. They were safe. He sank to his knees, his strength finally failing. The children rushed to him. Irit tore strips from his own tunic to bind Magnus's wounds. Astrid kissed his battered knuckles. Freya cooed and touched his beard. Magnus looked at them through a haze of pain and realized he was the richest man in the world. Years passed, and the legend of Oakhaven changed. They no longer spoke of the ogre of the mountain. They spoke of the guardian. The hut became a homestead. Eric grew into a master builder, expanding the cabin into a beautiful longhouse. Bjorn became a hunter who could track a ghost. The twins became healers, their garden famous for curing any ailment. And in the center of it all sat an old, white-bearded giant. He never spoke a word. He didn't need to. When he died, many winters later, he died in his sleep, surrounded by 5 children and 12 grandchildren. They didn't bury him in the cold earth. They built him up higher on the highest peak, closest to the stars. Eric stood before the flames, holding his own son. He never said a word to me, Eric told the gathering, but he told me everything I ever needed to know. The smoke rose into the northern sky, carrying the soul of the silent giant to Valhalla. And it is said that when he finally arrived in the great hall of the gods, for the first time in his life, he sang,